Theme 3 of Globalization, Cultural Exchange. A major thematic question of the 9th grade World History course was what happens when cultures interact. You learned early in the year that cultural interactions can result in assimilation, accommodation, appropriation, amalgamation, and extermination. By this point in our review, it should be clear that the Columbian exchange, European colonization of the Western Hemisphere, and the transatlantic slave trade were all cultural interactions that resulted, to varying degrees, in these effects. Many historians in North America, South America, Africa, and Europe have dedicated their lives to identifying, analyzing, and evaluating the short-term and long-term effects of the age of colonization. Volumes have been written explaining their conclusions. Instead of focusing on all of them, we will focus on 3 areas that are of particular importance to our studies in World History 10: Spanish colonial America, the west coast of Africa, and Western Europe. Spanish colonial America was united by the government and a singular force to impose the Iberian way of life on the New World. However, the culture that emerged was a mixture of European, African, and local native influences. The Spanish colonies themselves were diverse and complex, and separated by geographic obstacles, long distances, and different ethnic and racial makeups. Instead of saying that the New World was a replication of the Old World, it is more accurate to say that while Spanish settlers sought to institute the Spanish way of life, they created their own unique traditions and identities. The question is then, how did the Spanish promote the Spanish way of life? Repression of native religion and culture. They literally burned indigenous recorded histories, otherwise referred to as codices, that contained information about astronomy, astrology, religion, ritual, and gods. Catholic priests and missionaries saw these records as the work of the devil and sought to destroy them all. Because of this, what we know about pre-Columbian civilization is through the lens of the conquerors, who saw themselves as liberators. Since the 1970s, many native groups have been trying to regain knowledge of their ancestral culture as part of the process of redefining their historical and cultural identity. Coerced conversion to Catholicism. The Spanish were charged by the Pope and the Crown to convert all indigenous peoples to Catholicism. Spanish settlers and priests destroyed works of art and melted down religious items, sculptures, and jewelry before they were shipped to Spain. Remember also that the encomienda system was designed to protect the indigenous people under their care, but the reality was nothing more than enslavement and coerced conversion. Rather than forced conversion, the general attitude of missionaries was patient persuasion. It was difficult to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity, and the success of conversion varied in Spanish America because of the variety of circumstances. There were different tribes and civilizations, as well as different missionaries with varying tactics. The Jesuits achieved considerable success in conversion of some tribes because the priests learned the local languages and demonstrated bravery in the face of danger. The Franciscans focused on changing an indigenous people's traditional way of life, migratory or agricultural, by offering gifts and persuasion and safety from enemies. If slavery was a part of a local population's culture before the conquistadors arrived, Christian missionaries offered the protection of missions as a means to escape slavery. And although certain peoples were baptized in large numbers, many continued to maintain their own religious and cultural traditions, which missionaries struggled hard to undo. Some missionaries concluded that this unwillingness to abandon their own cultures in order to be fully transformed by Catholicism demonstrated that the indigenous peoples were inferior and incapable of understanding Christianity. The result was that in many areas the indigenous peoples simply blended Catholicism with their traditional beliefs. Lastly, the replacement of indigenous culture with Spanish culture. The Spanish language became the language of all the colonies in Central and South America. Even though some native languages still exist today, an infusion of Spanish can be heard in these languages: dress, gender roles, sexual division of labor, social classes, and nobility were marginalized and replaced by that of the Spanish. But how did the Spanish attempt to control the colonies? First, controlling who had power and demanding taxes. As mentioned in earlier podcasts, the Spanish crown only allowed Spanish-born officials to run the colonies. This gave the crown some semblance of control over an otherwise impossibly large, complicated, and vulnerable empire. In theory, the whole of the Spanish Empire was personal property of the king, and he granted land and appointed government positions to worthy subjects. The colonial government, the Council of the Indies, acted as an advisory board to the crown, and high-born nobles were appointed viceroys, or what we might refer to as governors, with a sizable amount of power, and they were expected to maintain law and order, profits, and protection of his particular portion of the colonial empire. Rich Spanish nobles held great political power, while poor Spaniards and people of mixed race had little or no voice. Usually, in more remote areas where indigenous peoples resided within their cultural group, there was a local indigenous chief that ruled over the group and collected taxes for the Spanish. Second, they established a racial caste system. In contrast to other European colonies in the New World, Spanish America was much more racially mixed. Race was determined by ethnic factors as well as who one's parents were. And given that there were a variety of racial mixtures, this created their own set of problems. So, where to start? How about at the beginning? The early Spanish in the New World were all men. It didn't take long to establish that intermarriage with indigenous peoples was a necessity, and whereas it was typical for colonial officials to bring their families with them to their post, Spanish women were virtually non-existent in the general population. Thus, it became almost immediately acceptable to racially intermarry and intermingle in Spanish America. But even in this racial mixing, there was social inequality. Marrying an Incan noblewoman or daughter of a chieftain was considered a privilege and greatly desired, because these women were considered socially superior to the general population of women. Even though all children from mixed marriages were labeled mestizo, children from high-born indigenous stock experienced higher social status. Still, mestizos were barred from various offices. They could not hold many jobs, and they were discriminated against in court. A colonial code of laws called limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood, was used to determine if a person who wanted to participate in public affairs was able to do so. The law required that such peoples prove that all their ancestors were Christian as far back as 10 generations, and yet a whole underground industry existed for faking documents and testimony about ancestry. If you could afford it and had the right connections, you could change your ancestral bloodline. All of this was then further complicated by the introduction of African slaves. Africans were placed at the bottom of the social pyramid, and specific attitudes towards them varied not only from individual to individual, but from region to region. African slaves were not evenly distributed throughout Spanish America. The vast majority of Africans were brought to the Caribbean islands and the northern and eastern coast of South America to work on the sugar plantations. Therefore, it follows that there are more people of African descent in the Caribbean and Brazil than there are in Chile and Argentina. Where sugar plantation or mining were chief profit makers, there was a considerable amount of slave labor. Cuba, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, for example. In other areas where cash crops and mining weren't possible, slaves were used in artisan and domestic work, such as Argentina and Costa Rica. Of course, there was voluntary and involuntary racial mixing with Africans by Spanish, mestizos, and indigenous peoples, but the general attitude was that Spanish blood moved a person up the social ladder, while African blood pulled a person down. Overall, their presence wasn't significant. Africans outnumbered the Spanish in the colonies. It is this mixture of Europeans, Americans, and Africans that created a new Latin American culture. Just as indigenous Americas held on to some of their cultural and religious beliefs, so too did Africans. Latin American culture is the term used to refer to the combination of the traditions of these three continents. But although it is a general term used to categorize all of Central and South America, it varies greatly from region to region because some areas had a larger concentration of indigenous peoples over Africans and vice versa. It is also worth mentioning that even though you look at a map of the Spanish colonies in the New World and see that Spain's land holdings stretch far into North America, tribes in the southwest of the United States preferred to avoid European contact as much as possible. Therefore, racial mixing in the Southwest was not constant, and a race-based caste system did not develop there. Upon analysis, it is fair to say that race played a dual role in colonial Latin America. On the one hand, it was a dividing factor. The color of one's skin and the amount of non-European blood not only led to prejudice and discrimination, but also greatly and legally limited one's economic, social, and political opportunities. On the other hand, the racial mixing and cultural interactions resulted in a vibrant, complex new culture. Of course, the development of this new culture was at the cost of the cultures of origin. It is also significant to recognize that establishing gender roles was important as well. Spanish America's culture and society was patriarchal. Although the activities of men and women varied by region, we can generalize that men decided its political future and controlled the economy. Men were also the hard laborers, mining, construction, merchant trade, and military service. Only men were allowed to pursue higher education. But to say that women did not play a pivotal role in the colonies is not fair to the contributions that men made without the fame and recognition. And yet, because of the racial and social diversity among women, these contributions varied. Women in service, specifically domestic service. They worked as cooks, wet nurses, and cleaners in elite households. During the early years, these women were mostly indigenous slaves until African slavery was introduced. Free women also worked in the domestic service, but in small quantities because they had the option of choosing among other employments. Women in certain regions were allowed to open and oversee plantations, own retail shops, sell wares in urban markets, and even toiled in artisan occupations, which were strictly banned. Elite and mid-level women had different experiences. Primarily responsible for the home and the bearing of children, these women managed domestic affairs, even the family's finances, and educated their children in cultural values. It is fair to generalize and say that if women were widowed or had a husband whose job required him to be away from the home for long periods of time, it was out of necessity that women were able to command control legally and financially over the family's affairs. As explained in The Impact of Iberian Culture in the New World, Spanish law guaranteed the wife's dowry, a legal protection against a husband squandering her wealth, and leverage to limit her husband's activities. Women, particularly widows acting for former husbands, operated businesses and held public offices. Some were wealthy, powerful, and even cruel encomenderos, supervising thousands of laborers. Current researchers have determined that 38% of households in late colonial Buenos Aires were headed by women. In Uruguay, a surprising number of women and their children owned and operated sugar plantations. We can conclude that although elite and mid-level young girls were typically kept away from male society, received a cloistered education, and were expected to marry for the betterment of the family, women could and did command a visible and vital presence in colonial society. Next, West Africa. Slavery already existed in Africa prior to the Arabs and the Europeans. However, it is important to understand the difference between the systems of slavery before we continue our analysis of West Africa. Europeans created a system of slavery that we refer to as chattel slavery. It was based on ownership and race. Black Africans were sold as property to remain in perpetual servitude for life, and were at the mercy and under the authority of their masters. They could not work their way out of slavery, as a bondservant would be able to do, nor could they convert to escape slavery, as a Muslim ruler might have allowed. This is in stark contrast to the African slave system that allowed slaves who were primarily prisoners of war, to work to pay off his or her debt to the society that the slave was originally at war against. Eventually, a slave would become a member of the society and could even marry into the ruling class of that society. So even though slavery did exist and Muslim traders were, in fact, slave merchants in Africa before the Europeans arrived, the system of slavery was, in comparison, one based on racial superiority, exploitation for commercial gain, and degradation of the subject peoples. We can break down the effects of the transatlantic slave trade into economic impact, political impact, and social impact. Economically, centuries of raiding, warring, and exporting, mostly men between the ages of 15 and 25, robbed Africa of its most important resource, human beings. This trade destroyed the labor force, creating insecurity and instability in the economy. It most affected labor-intensive enterprises such as agriculture and mining, where men were most needed. West African economy was agricultural and subsistence-level agriculture at that. And mining, particularly gold and salt mining needed for the gold for salt trade of the West African kingdoms, was also affected. One might ask why a group of people would voluntarily engage in such a heinous system. Well, first, it is safe to assume, as many Europeans noted at the time, that African slave raiders and traders didn't know or understand the conditions under which slaves were treated once they reached their destination. That being said, trade in slaves proved to be far more profitable than the traditional trade in gold. And since there was a constant and even growing demand for slaves from European traders, Africans simply figured out ways to meet that demand. Third, many Africans were interested in acquiring European goods, such as guns, ammunition, cloth, cooking utensils, and alcoholic beverages. Europeans purchased slaves primarily by trading their stuff for people. As Walter Rodney wrote in his classic work entitled How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, he says, "The changeover from gold mining to slave raiding took place within a period of a few years between 1700 and 1710, when the Gold Coast, known as Ghana, came to supply about 5,000 to 6,000 captives per year. By the end of the 18th century, a much smaller number of captives were exported from the Gold Coast, but the damage had already been done. It is worth noting the Europeans sought out different parts of West and Central Africa at different times to play the role of major suppliers of slaves to the Americas. This meant that virtually every section of the long western coastline between the Senegal and Kunene rivers had at least a few years' experience of intensive trade in slaves with all of its consequences. Besides, in the history of eastern Nigeria, the Congo, northern Angola, and Dahomey, there were periods extending over decades when exports remained at an average of many thousands per year. Most of those areas were relatively highly developed within the African context. They were leading forces inside Africa, whose energies would otherwise have gone towards their own self-improvement and the betterment of the continent as a whole. The slave trade stimulated little positive change in Africa because those Africans who benefited most were not investing in improving productive enterprises at home. Rodney concludes that the international slave trade discouraged internal trade in African commodities and provided incentives for Africans to continue trading in human cargo. In addition, West Africans became increasingly more dependent on European goods. As John Newman, a former slave captain, once wrote, "I verily believe that the far greater part of wars in Africa would cease if the Europeans would cease to tempt them by offering them goods for sale. I believe the captives reserved for sale are fewer than the slain." Politically, the transatlantic slave trade contributed to the instability as well as the expansion of politics in Africa. By seeking slaves in great demand and providing firearms upon trade for slaves, Europeans encouraged warfare and competition between kingdoms and tribes. The distribution of weapons helped some kingdoms and tribes obtain military and political supremacy over others. Some states, such as the Asante and the Dahomey, grew powerful and wealthy, while others were completely destroyed, their populations decimated, and their peoples and cultures absorbed by rivals. At the same time, some larger kingdoms, such as the Congo and the Oyo, slowly disintegrated as access to trading opportunities and firearms enabled outlying regions to establish their independence. In addition, political alliances forged between African groups were consistently betrayed, thus increasing distrust and hostility between groups. And some kings and aristocratic elite in some African states prospered, while the entire kingdom developed around the slave trade. It must be stated that many states and their rulers, including Angola and the Congo, strongly resisted slavery. However, the interests of those involved in the trade proved far too great to overcome. Socially, there were other ways that are not easy to calculate and evaluate, things that are taken for granted until they are lost: relationships, security, and self-worth. About 2/3 of the people sold to European traders were men. Although women and children were part of the trade, fewer women were sold. In the beginning of the trade, Europeans wanted the strongest laborers for field and mine work, and thus chose men over females. But women were also prized at home for the crucial role they played in agriculture and crafts. With such a hit to the male population, women bore the burden of rebuilding their violated communities. Interestingly enough, I recently read on the online edition of Foreign Policy magazine that a recent study has been making some interesting conclusions about the practice of polygamy in West Africa. Although the practice of a man taking more than one wife most certainly existed in Africa prior to the transatlantic slave trade, the researchers found that areas hardest hit were significantly more likely to have a high percentage of polygamous marriages. The study suggests that with fewer men available to be husbands to West African women, women were encouraged to enter into polygamous arrangements. The trauma a family and a tribe experiences when losing their young members and possibly even their figures of authority took an incalculable toll on the affected regions. Oral traditions in southern Ghana, for example, reported that there was no rest in the land, that people went about in groups rather than alone, and that mothers kept their children inside when European ships appeared. Peoples responded with an increased concern with and focus on protection, and some societies became more rigid and structured. With the focus on security, other concerns of state and tribe, such as economic and cultural development, were neglected. And finally, the transatlantic slave trade reinforced the stereotypical view of African peoples as savages, mainly because European slave traders needed a rationalization for their own barbarity. They claimed and propagated the idea that African cultures had no merit when compared to European civilization, and that the only purpose Africans served was as laborers. Unfortunately, in some instances, this notion of racial inferiority was internalized by Africans, and remains a controversial concept even today in the 21st century. Now, the effects on Europe are perhaps more complicated. Europe had already begun to undergo a cultural and intellectual renaissance, as I mentioned in our first podcast. And by the 15th century, its two stalwart medieval institutions, the Roman Catholic Church and the manorial system, were already being challenged and slowly dismantled in some countries. In fact, it was the growth of towns and cities, the desire to become part of the Asian trade network, the challenges facing the Roman Catholic Church, and increase in the power and importance of kings that led to exploration and fueled colonization. Europeans, after all, were the orchestrators of all the trade, movements of peoples, and cultural interactions. But we need a clear sense of what the effects of colonization and globalization were on Europe. Culturally, Europe absorbed little cultural traditions, customs, language, and practices of the indigenous peoples and of Africans. It was more the products of trade and colonization, more than the interactions of trade and colonization, that transformed European society. There were, of course, huge changes in diet and cuisine. Ethnic cuisines and culinary traditions were transformed because of potatoes, tomatoes, and corn, for example. Tea, coffee, and cocoa became symbols of civility, wealth, and sophistication, once sugar made the bitter drinks more palatable and addictive. Rum, tobacco, and cocaine infiltrated society and left their mark on their abusers. Although cocaine-filled snuff boxes were primarily the habit of the wealthy. The desire for these goods further encouraged the expansion of the merchant middle class in all Western European nations. This middle class was directly responsible for financing trade ventures, building settlements, expanding trade, and establishing joint stock companies, banks, and stock markets. As this group grew in wealth and access to education and cultural society, they aspired to move up the social ladder. But perhaps the greatest impact colonization and globalization had on Europe was the increased competition between kings and their national peoples, economically, culturally, and politically. Economic competition manifested itself in the struggle over control of the Atlantic slave trade routes and dominance over commodities markets such as furs, slaves, and sugar. European monarchs waged wars with each other over rights to a contested territory, raided and seized strategic and financially lucrative territories. The 7 Years' War, referred to in the United States as the French and Indian War, was the first true world war, fought on 4 continents and involved all of the great European powers of the early 18th century. The war was driven by the competing economic and political interests of the great powers of Europe. The 3 great Western European nations, England, France, and Spain, were all in competition with each other over trade and colonies in the Western Hemisphere, while the 2 great Eastern European countries, Prussia and Austria, struggled for dominance in Central Europe. Prussia, England, and Portugal allied against France, Austria, and Spain. The wars fought in and affected Europe, North America, Central America, the West African coast, India, and the Philippines. The war cost approximately 1.5 million lives and completely changed the fates of all the nations involved. England was the clear winner, with increased landholdings in North America, which included New France, Spanish Florida, some individual Caribbean islands, the colony of Senegal on the West African coast, and superiority over the French trading outposts on the Indian subcontinent. Prussia improved its position in Central Europe. While France was deprived of many of its colonies and saddled with a heavy war debt, Spain lost Florida but gained French Louisiana and regained control of its colonies such as Cuba and the Philippines that had been captured by the British during the war. But Portugal and Spain were not able to regain their status as great powers. Cultural competition manifested itself primarily in ostentatious displays of wealth and artistic advancements. Monarchs demonstrated their dominion over their subjects and their power compared to other monarchs by building elaborate palaces and churches, patronizing the arts, and throwing magnificent parties. Louis XIV, the French king, who referred to himself as the Sun King, commissioned the building of the spectacular palace at Versailles. Queen Elizabeth I of England loyally patronized the arts and theater, which gave rise to Shakespeare. Philip II of Spain, a devout and zealous Catholic, who was referred to as the most Catholic king, waged war against the Protestant English Queen Elizabeth in 1585, after she rejected his hand in marriage and had her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, beheaded when she discovered she was involved in a plot to overthrow her. Of course, it didn't help that Elizabeth also encouraged her naval commander Sir Francis Drake to raid Spanish, Portuguese, and French ships on the high seas and steal their gold, silver, and cargo. This might have also played a part in Philip II's decision to send the Spanish Armada to invade England. But unfortunately for Spain, their invincible armada was overcome because of a terrible storm right off the coast of England. Spain never recovered from the loss, and England managed to win the war and stake its claim as the successor to Spain as the dominant power in Europe. Of course, France contested this, but was beat by England at the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763. So the following questions remain. How do we look objectively at a period that clearly resulted in the establishment of our own country and set the course of the future of which we are now a part? How do we evaluate early globalization? What criteria do we establish to determine winners and losers? What weight do we give to the different types of effects, both positive and negative, and why? What weight do we give to the justifications for actions taken, and why? Even though it is now 5 centuries later, globalization exists and an even more integrated system than it was when it began. It is also just as controversial, if not more so. And the same questions still apply, and are still as difficult to answer. In our follow-up class, we will critically evaluate the content and perspectives we discussed and attempt to answer these questions.